It's custom suspension this week for the twin-turboed, Cummins-swapped 79 Bronco on 2.5-ton Rockwells.
We're not even all the way there. Got the axle pretty close to where I want it, as far back as it can go at full bump, which is where it sits. That way when it's at ride height, it'll move forward a little bit and it'll be centered in the wheel well. And I need just a tiny bit more clearance, so this gas tank, this isn't even the tank, it's just the cover. I'm gonna take the air hammer and push it back a little bit. But first, earplugs, because this is gonna be truly deafening. Wow, that's sturdier than I expected. Wow, that's a thick daddy. Got it all aligned and measured, time to cut the rear lower links. Man, this thing is very close to having all of the 4-link in. Time to put in the first rear link. Look at that. Man, this thing is so beefy. We really went all out here. We went from tiny stuff to basically a mega truck.
Oh, you're checking square now?
Yeah, just out of curiosity. Perfectly square.
No way.
Yep. I mean, as perfect as our measuring system is. That's
Yeah.
awesome. That means it's gonna drive straight instead of like crab walk. We don't have a Josh here today, but what we do have is some parts that he designed and cut out for us. This is going to be the steering ram mount for the front axle. So I'm tacking it together here, then I'll test fit, and then weld it all up, and then weld it to the axle, and then we can mount the steering ram.
I could like put this on my chest and I'd look immediately like Iron Man.
So we'll just kind of eyeball it first. I'll tack one, lift your end up a little. Time to start doing some CAD of my own here for shock mounts. There's a million things left to do, and one of them is mount the shocks.
If you guys didn't know, we're giving away a 2013 lifted off-road BRZ or $10,000. Every $5 spent on our merch gets you an entry to win.
I'm gonna actually put it right at the front edge, so the bolt for the shock's gonna run this way, mount tab here with one hole in it, and then the shock will actually sit a little forward of this so that it can clear all of this stuff during articulation, and then I'll have a tab that goes down and in, and then of course gussets for all of that.
Frederick, Bjorn. I didn't think you're supposed to be in the garden.
Got my front shock mounts drawn up here. Kind of hard to see what's going on, but it'll all make sense once they're made out of steel instead of pixels. Couple of lower front shock mounts. I think those turned out pretty good. Nice and small, nice and beefy. I'm just go on the front of the axle, like so.
Nice.
Somewhere probably a little more, well, I guess I'll find out by doing this. Yeah, something like that. If it was too close,
as the suspension flexed down on this side, the shock would go at an angle in and could run into the frame. So I'll take the springs out of the shock and compress it all the way so I can see what it's going to actually look like mounted in there.
These are filled with nitrogen. Sadly, I'm gonna have to let it out to get everything test fitted because we can't compress it and hold it compressed with the pressure of the nitrogen in there. So we'll let it escape. Cool. Look at that. Fully compressed shock absorber. Do I have a Sharpie? Yes, I do. Some late night CAD going on. Frame rail of the chassis goes here. Shock mounts there. I have it kind of cut back like this for articulation clearance. The top is flat and up a little bit so that I can mount a tube there for a shock hoop that goes over the engine to reinforce it for, you know, jumping. Got the rest of my pieces for all the upper shock mounts cut out. These ones I all did all on the plasma, and then these pieces, because they're straight and square, I just did them on the Piranha way faster, and then no slag to clean off. So clean them up, tack them together, and see if we can get this thing shocks on before passing the heck out. I want it to be at a little bit of an angle back when the axles travel all the way up, because that's its longest point on its arc. And if you're thinking that's running into the steering column, well, it is, but that's okay because the new steering column is just a little box that runs the hydraulic system. Yeah, that looks like probably a pretty good spot for the shock mount. Got the front shock mounts pretty much done last night, so this morning, time to move on to the rear shock. It doesn't necessarily make the most sense from an efficiency standpoint to go back and forth, front to rear, and then do other things, but I'm doing it in the most order of highest priority. If we have 4 shocks mounted, it can go on its own weight, and then I can do the bump stops. You know, just in case we run out of time. Also, Dog enjoys putting his ball inside of wheels, and this time the wheel has a big enough hole that he can actually, try to get it out. Is this what you're looking for? Yeet. I've just cut out one super basic shock tab, which goes somewhere on here. But because of the angle of it, it's gonna be at some weird angle like this. I just did one. I'm gonna bolt it to the shock, tack it onto the axle, and then I can easily measure the other side because I'm modeling in 2D because it's way faster. So that's the plan. You'll notice that this is sort of at a
I don't know, 45-ish degree angle to the axle. It's really just to make it so that the heims, you can see how these heims have flex in them on the end of the axle. But then of course this way they have unlimited pivot. So the idea here is that if I put that at sort of a 45 degree angle, any movement of the axle, because the shock's gonna change angle this way and this way as the suspension cycles, if I put it at kind of a 45, then no matter which direction that is going, it's split between the articulation of the heim and the pivot of the heim, because that way it's not, no direction is relying solely on this axis of movement. That way we don't have any binding. That's the theory anyway. This should be all the remaining parts I need for the rear lower shock mounts. So I've got the other side of the, you know, bracket and then 4 gussets that should be more or less symmetrical top to bottom if I mathed right.
I'm just throwing in the spacers on these big boy shocks over here, and then I'm throwing a nut and a bolt on them so that we don't lose anything in the sand like we always do.
Got all the rest of these parts cut out. So this is all of the parts for one side rear shock mount. Those are the rest for this one. You may have noticed we have some extra crew here today. We got Mac and George filming for eBay Motors, so, you know, they have slightly better cameras than we do.
I feel inadequate now.
Time to see if my non-math worked. Oh, that's a lot too big. How did that end up so big? These little things are not gonna work, but a little trimming on these and they will. It's just a smidgen thicker than the shock, so that A, I can not get welder berries all over the shock, and B, when I weld it and it shrinks, the shock will still fit. Version 2 of the gusset turned out a lot better. So weld this on, then make an upper and see how it do.
I was getting attacked by a beetle. What would be stuck?
Lower shock mounts all solidly welded onto the axle because I'm pretty certain that's where they're gonna stay. And I have 1/2 of the upper done on both sides and heavily tacked. I'm not gonna rely on it to hold weight. What I'm gonna do is slowly lower the other side and do the articulation test again in the rear and see what everything looks like. That's exciting. We're not far from having 4 shocks be able to be mounted to this thing, which is a good place to be. Not even all the way there.
It could go into a colossal trench and still just be putting around completely upright.
Yes. Finally figured out all the rest of the parts for the upper shock mounts here. Got the other side already welded. Weld this side together, and then all of the shock mounts, front and rear, will be done. All 4 shocks done. It's time to do some bump stop mounts. I took all the nitrogen out of it so that I could squish it all the way. And in ideal situations, it would be outboard of the shock, but there isn't any space. And the reason for that is just that if at full articulation, the bump would still protect the shock from being slammed. Whereas if it's inboard and this side is articulated all the way up, the shock would actually bottom out before the bump. But you can also adjust for that. Here's the bits of bracket that I designed up, complete with my favorite shape, hexagons, because I couldn't build this thing without putting any hexagons in it. So these 2 pieces here go something like this on either side, and then hold it up at the frame.
this final bump stop mount tacked in. Now it's time to set the height of the bump stop. The rest of them are still long, and it'll save time and energy to not compress all of them. So I'm going to use this one that's compressed and go around and set the height for all of them. So I've got it in here nice and snug. So I have the shock in here for length, and I have this pushing down on the axle fairly strongly. Now I'll just measure how many threads are showing, and then I can do the same on this one, and then when I let it down I can just put this in there, and it'll be set so that when it's fully compressed, this and the shock bottom out at almost the same time, although we want this to stick down a little bit more so we don't break the shocks. It turns out the microphone on our camera did not like filming in the rain all day. All of the explanations I did about building all of these parts are gone. This little box is called an orbital valve, and it takes the place of a traditional steering box in a hydraulic steering system. It takes input from the steering wheel and turns it into hydraulic power. And conveniently, because it doesn't need to physically connect to the rest of the steering system, it can be mounted just about anywhere. So it was very easy to mount with a simple tube mount welded to the frame. We needed a power steering pump that was sized to the RPM of the engine and the size of the ram. I made some custom brackets to mount the power steering pump roughly where the old belt tensioner pulley used to be. And then I used the alternator as the new tensioner and just made a new bracket so that it could be adjusted with some very high-tech tools, aka a pry bar. Got this little bracket cut out for the power steering reservoir, and I put some riv nuts in it to be fancy. So this is a sleeve made out of pipe that fits press fit into this and onto that. So this is the part that goes to the transmission. This is the part that goes to the front axle. So if I can get it relatively straight, it'll be a front drive shaft. That part there is centered, and that has a countersink hole. So if I put the live center in there.
Oh, that's about as big of a thing as you could put in this lathe.
It's certainly the biggest thing I have put in it. If the driveline shop wasn't busy for the next 2 weeks, we could just have this made custom. So if it ever breaks, we can just take the ends to a driveline shop and be like, hey, make a new one. Yeah, that would have been real good.
That would have been a wobble.
Yeah. This is just a make sure I'm not a moron before I weld both ends together situation. That's pretty much maximum extension on the slip yoke here. And that's exactly what we want, because that way we have the maximum amount of travel left for it to get shorter as the suspension goes up. So. This was the only 1.25" by 13 threads per inch nut to be found in all of Sandpoint, attached to a, what was that, 2 5/16 trailer ball. This nut is twice as thick as it needs to be. I'm gonna put it in the mill and make it half as thick. Works. It's bigger diameter than the other side, so if anyone looks closely, they'll notice that, but it'll certainly get us through the Rubicon. Although, I need a little spacer. I found a spacer for the other side. This is a cutoff from the tie rod material itself, actually, and exactly the right ID.
welding right next to the fuel lines too. That's always good.
Well, I ran out of the nice, fresh, shiny 3/16ths, so I'm down to this old crusty, rusty stuff. It's all warped. And it doesn't want to fit on the plas table being warped, so I'm making some gussets for the frame. I'm just going to box in the chassis. It's an open C channel like this, so I'm just cutting some plates to box it in where the link mount subframe bolts on, because right now it's kind of wiggly. So I'm going to make these boxes, and then I'll put crossbars in between them to make it extra beef. Because this piece is all warped, and because I'm just cutting a rectangle, I'm not going to bother using the CNC. It's not worth the time. Yeah, this was from back before we had a CNC. It's right where this part all attaches, and without that, this whole inside edge of this bracket is just pushing on this unsupported edge of metal, so it can just kind of, this whole thing can angle back and forth because this edge can bend up. But if we tie it to the top with this, it won't be able to do that.
Next week, we're putting this Bronco on 43s and doing the first test ride.